Hello and welcome to the Theory Zone, where we will be discussing representations. Specifically, Stuart Hall's theory of representation, so we're going to take in all manner of stuff, particularly the constructionist approach towards representation, and discuss, of course, stereotypes as well. This is actually the first of two videos on Stuart Hall, because he had so much to say on the subject. This first video is going to explore and deconstruct how and why the media reinforces various stereotypes, and of course we're going to use that to explore Stuart Hall's constructionist approach. So first of all, a question you may have been thinking about for a little while now, but I'd like you to think of a group that has regularly been stereotyped across a range of different media products and types. Think about specific texts if you can. A couple of questions to mull over. Has that stereotype changed over time? Has it evolved? Do we see a change in the way the stereotype is presented? Or has it changed across different types of media? And the second question is it clear why the stereotype has been used? In other words, is there a purpose or a reason for that stereotype to be used? And does that depend on the type of media or the text itself? Now, your own answers to those questions will be dependent on the particular social group that you chose initially, but this video hopes to go some way to helping you understand the collection of stereotype or the stereotyped group that you have collected a bunch of media texts for in this, and so your knowledge of that group and the way they've been stereotyped will evolve throughout this lesson, hopefully. So we're going to use a couple of examples. The first one I'm going to use, I guess, is a social group. It's a role within society and, I guess, a job, and that's the police force. Specifically, we're going to look at the British police. And I have, to start us off, not picked 4 different media products. I've just picked 4 photographs, which might be kind of a way of easing us in. 2 of these photographs are clearly quite old photos, as signified by their black and white colour scheme, and 2 other photos are fairly new, as denoted by their colour photographs. So all I want you to do is just do a little bit of analysis as to how are these representations different? How are the older representations of the police different from the more modern representations of the police? Now, obviously, I've selected these 4 photographs very specifically and for good reason, because I think there are some quite clear differences. But it's just to show you that just how different you can represent a group in society just through a simple selection of images. In the older photographs, the police are represented as perhaps being more isolated or independent, shall we say. People who work alone, people who are always perhaps on the go and doing work. In the image on the top, we see the officer talking to a man in the street. Okay, clearly Bobby on the beat. What's interesting about this photograph as well is that whilst the quality of the image isn't great, we can see how the police officer actually sort of towers above the man, and that sort of gives an indicator of a kind of power difference or authority. The police as an authority figure. In the lower image, we see the policeman in the telephone box making notes on the phone to someone, so clearly working, again, on the job, doing what he is supposed to be doing, possibly some sort of investigation or calling into the station about something. But again, alone, again, very smartly dressed in that kind of very traditional uniform with the very high helmet and the shiny boots, that kind of very old-fashioned representation of the police. The 2 newer photographs quite different in their own way. The first and most noticeable difference, whenever I show students this, people realise that the officers are smiling. The representation is of a police force that is approachable, friendly and happy. Of course, the other most notable difference is that the police are in pairs in this instance, and in both cases it's 1 male and 1 female. So whereas the older photographs represent the police as working alone and only being male, these newer images of the police represent them as being both male and female, and also you'll notice that the police come from different ethnicities as well. So there's a representation of the BAME community within the police also, which is not represented in that older photographs. So we've got this difference in the way that police are. I mean, the way that are represented as well, being shot in close-up and medium shot, as opposed to the long shots, makes them feel a little bit more approachable and identifiable and relatable, perhaps. One thing that is interesting is that that's picked up on by students whenever I show these photographs are that the colour photograph at the bottom shows the police force wearing the stab-proof vests, which may indicate a lack of respect that the police have in more modern times, which is an interesting take. It wouldn't necessarily be the preferred reading of that photograph, but it is a reading nonetheless. So that's quite an interesting one to look at. Also, what's interesting is another, again, negotiated or oppositional reading of these photographs, but with the police smiling for the camera, taking the photo opportunity. Some students have read this as being the police force more media savvy and perhaps interested in publicity and representation than actual police work. Again, not necessarily the intention of the photos, but a reading nonetheless. But what I do like is that perhaps certainly the photograph at the bottom shows the police being in a very residential street, kind of domesticated area, so police that work within the community. So again, some similarities, but quite a lot of differences there. And, as I said before, I have very specifically selected these 4 photographs to highlight the differences. The representation is mine. In this instance, I am the encoder. But I'm trying to do it in a way to stereotype the police, and mostly in positive ways. But that's not to say that, stereotypes are always positive. In fact, we mostly think of stereotypes as being negative. And if we keep the same representation here of a social group, we can see some more negative representations of the police. The representation on the left is a magazine cover for a magazine called Private Eye. This is a reaction to a story from about 15 years ago when London Metropolitan Police officers in plain clothes mistakenly took the life of a Brazilian student when they thought he may be a terrorist agent, which caused a huge amount of controversy at the time, and threw a spotlight on the different techniques and ways in which the Metropolitan Police worked, where the chief police officer sort of claimed his own innocence and did not accept responsibility. So you can see the headline of "Top London Cop Won't Resign," and him saying, "I'm entirely innocent." So the police saying, "We better shoot you." So it's a very satirical take on this, quite dark in its humour, but then Private Eye is a satirical magazine. It pokes fun at the establishment and takes aim at authority. The right-hand side is a cartoon, a single-celled cartoon strip from either a newspaper or magazine, the sort of images that we would now see as kind of memes online. And this is a police officer working at a computer and working through some sort of flow chart. The icon appears, young black male, and then the computer is telling him to stop and search, indicating and implying that there is some sort of systemic or institutionalized racism within the police force, which again is something that has been levelled at various forces. And this particular media product, this cartoon, is using that simplified stereotype. And essentially that's what stereotypes are really, where key aspects of a group can be emphasised or exaggerated and overly stereotyped. And that's what we often refer to as stereotyping. So let's stick with this as a social group, stereotypes of the police, okay? And this is really to emphasise the fact that we may have a single stereotype of a group in mind, but more often than not, there might be multiple stereotypes attached to a social group. For example, teenagers, you may have looked at in your answer to the first question. Teenagers are very rarely stereotyped as just one thing. There are often numerous stereotypes of teenagers. But let's stick with the police. I'm going to give you 2 different stereotypes, and I want you to come up with some media products that you are aware of that would fit into either of these. First stereotype of police as being the heroic public servant. Okay, so this might be a more sort of traditional stereotype of the police as people that we look up to in society, people who are there as guardians of society and protectors of the public. And the second stereotype that exists within the media, the stereotype of the corrupt cop, of the police officer who works and operates outside of the law, even for their own betterment and may be involved in criminal activity. So see if you can come up with some specific media products from a different range of media that might fulfill either of these stereotypes. Well, look, I'm sure you had plenty here. These are both quite well-known stereotypes and archetypes. I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's have a look at the heroic public servant. Let's start with possibly the most famous cop in cinema's history, John McClane, played by Bruce Willis in the Die Hard series of films. He's a tough New York cop who's good at his job, who we initially see in a movie set in Los Angeles whilst he's off duty visiting his estranged wife. He then has to go back into cop mode to save a huge building full of employees from some would-be terrorists, and he carries on finding it very hard to die despite all the odds in another 3 movies, I think, or maybe 4. But that's John McClane, the heroic public servant, the tough cop who gets the job done. Okay, in less fictional terms, more realism, newspapers. This is actually a newspaper from America. However, this was a common stereotype of police officers in the wake of the events of 9/11 in 2001, the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers in New York. The police were rightly represented as heroes, as people who had put their life on the line to save a city and save the people. This particular representation actually is a sort of follow-up story some years later of how actually some of the police force and the public servants who had helped in that time were now being let down by their city through benefits and things like that. But this is the front page headline: Hope for a desperate hero. The bank delays sale of ailing 9/11 cops home for now. So again, the police being represented as a hero, really. And then thirdly, this is an advertisement, but also a sort of recruitment drive for a local police force. The copy reading, "Are you ready to stand out?" Black and white image with the only splashes of colour being the protective jackets of the 2 police officers. Very similar to the earlier photographs I showed you, but 2 police officers working in a team, quite clearly in a British train station, protecting our, I suppose, public areas, looking quite serious off into the distance. But yeah, quite sort of almost quite dramatic and heroic image there. Okay, let's have a look at the stereotypes of the corrupt cop. And I suppose I couldn't let this pass without including a reference to the Compton-based rap group NWA, who were very huge, I suppose, in part of the introduction of gangster rap in the late 1980s and early 90s, specifically in California and Los Angeles and the city of Compton. They often railed against police corruption and police brutality. In one of their most famous tracks, F the Police, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, actually tells a story of young black men being profiled and targeted and violently assaulted by police officers. Another example of the corrupt cop we can see in video games with the character Frank Tenpenny, who makes an appearance in Grand Theft Auto franchise, one of the biggest video games franchises of all time. He's one of the main protagonists that characters play in the Grand Theft Auto San Andreas game. And again, he's a corrupt cop, part of a sort of crime syndicate that actually uses his knowledge to kind of exploit and make money for himself and others. And then finally, a TV show a bit closer to home in Britain, the hugely and highly rated Line of Duty series, which explores corruption within the police force over a number of different seasons. So again, 2 stereotypes being used in different ways. So what I'd like you to do is follow this up. From the group you chose in our starter activity, can you collect a selection of texts that reinforce that stereotype? So we might as well get a definition down at this period. We've been talking about it long enough. A standardized, usually oversimplified, mental picture or attitude that is held in common by members of a group. Okay, so that suggests that you cannot hold a stereotype just by yourself. It's not something that you alone may hold. It's usually accepted, shared, or understood by a number of people. So let's just take a moment to look at 2 of the texts that you've chosen to prove exactly how they fit into this particular stereotype. So I want you to discuss the codes used and how important the context is. It's obviously clear that positive and negative representations and the use of stereotypes can be hugely influenced by the context of the society and the history of what's going on at the time. It's important to note that the media doesn't really create stereotypes. They're usually formed by people and then reinforced by the media. That's not really the kind of modus operandi of the media. So have a think back though. Let's have a look at those stereotypes you've created. So do an analysis of just 1 or 2 of the texts that you found that reinforces that stereotype. And what I'd like you to think about is, how has that context of history, how has the moment in which that stereotype was constructed had an impact on that stereotype? How does it help us understand that stereotype? If you've been able to do that, what it should have revealed, or maybe what it can lead on to next, is looking at the continuity between the reasons why the media perpetuates stereotypes. And so that's my next question really. Why do we stereotype? Okay, just take a moment, make a short list yourself of the different reasons why stereotypes are constructed. Now this is a really interesting question, and some of you who study psychology or sociology may have a number of answers that are based in those fields of study. Some psychologists might argue that we stereotype groups as a means of kind of protecting ourselves, as a way of kind of reinforcing the sort of idea of the tribe or the herd or the family in some ways. But of course, as media students, we want to look at the reasons why we stereotype within the media. And undoubtedly, some of you will have had some of these ideas that we're going to cover in your own lists. To answer this question, we're going to identify or look at the work of a writer called Richard Dyer, who has been writing about representations for many years now and still continues to do so. He's also one of the first people to take the idea of star studies seriously when analysing movies. But for our purposes, of course, we're going to be looking at the functions of a stereotype. And Richard Dyer's first function of a stereotype that he identifies is that we use stereotypes in the media as an ordering process. In other words, they are a way of making sense of the world. In a media text, it's sometimes really useful to simplify complicated ideas, and stereotypes help us do this. So let's take a couple of examples. In a text from the horror genre, a movie, a horror film, for example, the antagonist might be zombies, because it's easy to recognise that zombies are sort of flesh-eating monsters that want to kill you, and so you don't really need to do much work filling in the background of characters or giving huge amounts of detail to or characterization. If you were making a movie about the Second World War, or a TV show, or any kind of representation of the Second World War, we know that the Nazis are the bad guys. That's going to be the role that they fulfill. It's a way of ordering the narrative and making things easy for us. However, a couple of questions. is it problematic to use stereotyping as an ordering process? It seems fairly harmless. Certainly in the case of zombies, it's probably not a bad thing to stereotype them. However, if we look at my second example of Nazis, it's a little bit more complicated. Why might someone be offended by the oversimplification in the representation of Nazis? Now, I'm going to caveat that question. I'm not at all concerned, and I'm not talking in the slightest about offending Nazis. Okay, we are not talking about perhaps worrying whether or not someone who does have beliefs that are shared with that extreme position being offended that they were oversimplified by a movie. What I would like you to do, however, is to seriously consider why other people might be offended by the stereotyping of a group like Nazis. Well, the image I've put on the screen there next to, on the right hand side, is a kind of a clue as to one of the answers to this question, albeit a little bit convoluted. The image itself is from a film from the 1980s called Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones film in that franchise, directed by Steven Spielberg. It is often regarded as one of the great action-adventure movies ever made, and indeed it is a brilliant, great fun, silly, daft, incredibly exciting action film, and I urge anyone who's into action movies to see it. The story follows a archaeologist and adventurer called Indiana Jones as he tries to discover and seek out an old relic called the Ark of the Covenant that's mentioned in the Bible. But he's hot on his heels. He's in a race against time with the Nazis, as this is a film set in the 1930s, before the Second World War, but on the Nazi Party's rise to power. They too want the Ark of the Covenant because they believe it holds the supernatural powers that will help them take over the world. And so, of course, as you would imagine, Indy, our hero, ends up in a number of fights and conflicts with the Nazis. Some of these baddies are there throughout the duration of the film, but many of them are the kind of typical henchman characters that Indy dispatches with ease along the way. And of course, the film is a sort of family-friendly movie. It doesn't take any of its subject matter too seriously. And of course, it's certainly not a political film. But what that does is it turns the Nazis in the movie into little more than a sort of cartoon characters. Very simplistic, two-dimensional characters that we understand very quickly as being the baddies. But the problem being is that when you turn a group in society into oversimplified baddies that were real and that were in history actually stood for something, then that's when you encounter problems. The Nazi Party and those who followed their ideology, of course, believed in some incredibly serious and terrible things. The extermination of the Jewish race, and of course enacting that through the Holocaust, is something that history will never forget, and is of course a traumatic memory for many people, whether they survived or whether they are the ancestors of those who survived. 6 million people were killed. So is it appropriate to represent Nazis, people who believed in the execution and the murder of innocent people? Is it appropriate to portray them as nothing more than cartoon baddies, as simple foot soldiers that can be dispatched by a fictional hero? Does it not sort of deny the memory of those who passed by representing a horrible group in such a simplistic way? And that's possibly the problem with this idea of using stereotypes as an ordering process. If that seems like an over-analysis, or that perhaps we wouldn't ever forget based on the simple representations within an action film. My fourth image for you here is a movie whereby the baddies are zombie Nazis. And of course that one step removal from what Nazis actually were may indeed be considered slightly offensive, as the portrayal is clearly a step further away from the historical reality of what the Nazis did. So even though using stereotypes as an ordering process is often very harmless and just a way of understanding a text, it doesn't come without its own baggage. Okay, number 2. And this is possibly the most common use of stereotypes across all media: a shortcut to meaning. Using stereotypes in a media text means that obviously a great deal of information can be quickly understood if the audience has a shared understanding of stereotypes. So, let's have a think about this. Let's use another job as a social group to assess this with. I'm going to pick traffic wardens. Okay, so can you think of a media text, first of all, that uses the stereotype of a traffic warden, and then can you write down the qualities we associate with traffic wardens? Now, just before we do this, I'd like to offer another caveat that we're not talking about actual traffic wardens here. If you know anyone who is a traffic warden, or if you are one yourself, I'm not talking about you as a person. I am only talking about the media portrayal of traffic wardens, the stereotype, which I'm sure many of you had some of these words on your list: officious, annoying, stubborn, bureaucratic, unfair or petty, mean, cruel, lacking in empathy. All of these rather quite nasty and not very nice qualities can be attributed to traffic wardens if we only were to consume the media. This is our understanding of them, irrespective of our own experiences with them. But that is the media stereotype. And so, if you were to use that stereotype of a traffic warden in a media product, you would, by association, suddenly conjure up all of the words on the right. So as you can see, it's quite a useful shortcut to meaning. You need a character in your TV show who is annoying and stubborn and lacking in empathy, but don't have time to write that character in much detail, or don't have time to make them evolve within an episode. If you made them a traffic warden, then your audience will quickly understand all of those things just from the job title they have. So it's a shortcut to meaning. It condenses the amount of information. And of course, this use of stereotypes isn't necessarily used to attack the stereotype group. I don't think every time a traffic warden has been written into a sitcom or a soap opera or a drama or any other kind of media product, it's been done specifically to attack the profession of traffic wardens, but it's there to fill in that complex information quickly, or to create an effect. So, seeing as we have a shared understanding of stereotypes, sometimes you can use that to have an impact on your audience, as we'll see in 2 clips here. First one from a comedy sketch show called Trigger Happy TV. This is a no stopping or waiting zone. Yeah. So you can't stop here, afraid. All right. Yeah? Can you carry on? Yeah, I'm going. Yeah? Thank you. I'm not stopping. Well, it's the law. So you've done it again now. This is a no stopping zone, I'm sorry. Yeah, is it traffic? What? Is it traffic? Well, I mean, there's always an excuse, but it is the law, I'm afraid. I know, but it's the traffic. Well, that's twice you've stopped now. Sorry. Sir, please, I'm going to have to ask you to move on, because this is absolutely no stopping. There's no parking here, yeah? Sorry? No parking. Hey? It's no parking, double yellow. I stopped, I'm waiting for the traffic lights, didn't I? You what? I'm waiting for the traffic light. Are you? Alright. Instead of green, but don't park. Not on my patch, never. Okay, so the show, obviously being a sketch show, you'd expect it to use humour. And of course, what this does is it uses our expectations, our knowledge of the traffic warden stereotype, and it exaggerates them to an absurd level, reinforcing humour. Okay, so stereotypes can often be used for humorous purposes. They reinforce what we expect and can be exaggerated. So in this instance, the prankster, this is a hidden camera show. The actor is called Dom Jolly. known for his pranks, dresses up as a traffic warden and then takes that stereotype to sort of hyperbolic proportions, giving someone a ticket for being in a traffic jam or just stopped at the lights, of course, which isn't what would really happen. And again, he's probably not using that as an opportunity to attack the profession of traffic wardens, but he's using our knowledge as a way of exaggerating it and creating humour. Let's look at the second use of stereotypes of traffic wardens and see how this is this use of the stereotype has a different impact, slightly different.
Go on, you've got about 3 foot. 1 foot. Excellent.
Look, I've walked from the car to the machine.
I've just been going to get it.
Yeah, just a wee bit slow there, though, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, I've taken a picture now. You'll have to take that. And I'll probably do your car later on.
I haven't even took the baby out of the seat.
Just pulled up. He pulled up before. Yeah, but it's only money.
It's not. What do you mean it's only money?
If you've got an issue, here's a tissue.
Just wait a minute, 1 minute.
Don't do that.
At 16:24.
It's close.
Boom! Welcome to Brighton.
I can't accept this.
How can I take it? I've only just
I
arrived.
know, but
It's your mistake.
I'll tell you what.
No, you're not telling me what at all.
Is that a parking ticket?
Please don't do this. Right.
Get out of the car and ring to pay for the bike. I know what you just look. Get out.
You have goofed up big time.
Nobody likes nasty surprises, so we let you fix your bill, then top up if you need to. UFix from T-Mobile.
Okay, so again, the T-Mobile advert there, using the understanding we have of the stereotype of traffic wardens, initially for humorous purposes, as we see the kind of traffic wardens being unfair in ridiculous situations, people freaking out over it. But of course, the main reason is to give it a twist. The twist in the narrative, if you like, the story, is that actually, rather than giving people tickets, they're handing out money, challenging our expectations, undermining the stereotype. Okay, to make a point for the advert is that you can save money or something like that. So anyway, that's the stereotype is quite useful there because, of course, it's about challenging what people expect, maybe equating that with the company as well, that corporate entities don't usually give you money, and neither do traffic wardens. So there you go, shortcut to meaning. All right, I'm sure you'll be able to think of plenty of the examples that you found earlier where the stereotype was being used purely as a shortcut to meaning. We move on to something a bit more ideological, and this is why this is one reason why we use stereotypes, or the media uses stereotypes, as a reference to the world. As we've seen already, that the use of stereotypes in the media can mean that characters and situations are quickly understood, but they can also tell us something about the sort of bigger world that we live in. So my example here is perhaps the stereotype of someone who has problems with alcoholism might be used for a bigger picture, not as a way of kind of necessarily even making a comment on a specific individual or alcoholism itself, but it might be used as a way of explaining society's problems, not necessarily be a comment on an individual or even to demonize or oversimplify people who suffer with alcoholism, but actually they might be used as a way of talking about society's problems. So the stereotype of someone who has problems with alcoholism might include, an alienation from family, or a breakdown of the mental health, or maybe the losing a job or something like that. But this representation might be used to talk about perhaps a lack of mental health services in society. It might be used to talk about problems revolving around masculinity and identity. The stereotype of an alcoholic might be used to discuss the economic problems in society. So you're using a stereotype, but actually you're using it as a step to talk about a larger issue, a bigger problem, because that stereotype helps us understand those bigger issues, helps us see a bigger picture from that. So have a think about this, quite a tricky question. Are there other groups that you can think of that are stereotyped, but specifically as a means to explore other issues or to tell a bigger story? So they're not stereotyped to make a comment about that group, but they are stereotyped because they fit as a piece in a bigger puzzle. So similar to the question we looked at with the first reason for stereotyping, in that is it, even if it's for a good cause, even if perhaps you're stereotyping a group to tell a bigger story, is this still problematic, and why? My final question is what potential effects are there of stereotyping groups of people for this purpose? Are there problems, even if we said it's kind of benevolently done, if it's done for to tell a bigger story? Is there an impact that could be had? Well, I think the answer to those last two questions is that possibly it could be problematic. If we were to take my example of using the stereotype of someone who has problems with alcoholism as a way of maybe telling a story about, or telling, exploring an issue such as masculinity or mental health. The problem with using a stereotype is that it is still a very narrow picture of that group of people, that it might paint with too broad a stroke and make us think that everyone who has problems with alcohol has problems with mental health. It might make us think that everyone who has issues with alcohol is perhaps going to be a certain way, or has problems for certain reasons. So it might change the way that broader society looks at that group. So it could be still seen as problematic, even if it's there to do a kind of a harmless thing. Number 4. Why do we stereotype? Well, the media can stereotype because it is expressing its own values. In other words, some media texts and institutions will use stereotypes to impose their own ideologies or values onto their audience and therefore reinforce them. Okay, a bit of an open goal this one, but let's use the newspapers, and in particular The Sun, which for a number of years now has continually demonized and negatively stereotyped Muslims as dangerous terrorists, or people who are trying to subtly and continually erode British society. I've picked one of the more famous headlines from the past few years: 1 in 5 Brit Muslims sympathy for jihadis. A very spurious and inaccurate claim made by The Sun based on some data that they kind of manipulated in certain ways. You can read all about that. However, this headline, using a negative stereotype of Muslims as violent and condoning violence, is there not as a scoop or breaking news. It's there to reinforce the values of the Sun newspaper and its proprietor, Rupert Murdoch, whose own ideologies surrounding immigration are very negative. He's very anti-immigration. He and his papers used that as one of its main arguments for the UK to leave Britain in the European referendum in 2016. So the paper itself has a pro-Brexit stance and an anti-immigration one as well. And so whilst there is not a kind of direct link between the jihadi story and Brexit, it all fits into a central ideology and agenda that the paper has. So other than using stereotypes for a shortcut to meaning, we could probably argue this is the most prevalent use of stereotypes in the media. But why might we consider using stereotypes as an expression of values? Why might we consider that to be the most dangerous use of stereotypes? And what media products can you think of that routinely and often use stereotypes as a way of promoting their own values or pushing their own agenda? Finally, what effect do you think this has on the group being stereotyped? Well, there's a number of answers to those questions, and you might say that the reason it's so dangerous is because it does reduce a group of people in society to little more than a oversimplified set of signifiers, which itself is problematic because you're denying a group of people the complexity of who they really are. But it can also be dangerous because the audience starts to see that group of people only as that stereotype. Often there is, and we will discuss this later, an inequality in the power systems between the media and those that they stereotype. So they can often, if they are negatively stereotyped, this negative stereotype can replace reality. The impact this has on the group being stereotyped, they can often feel alienated, belittled, they can feel demonized, they could feel ostracized and not part of a society. And of course, they could often feel victimized and sometimes scared of an audience that consumes media and might believe the media products that they see, might believe the stereotypes that they read, if that stereotype portrays them as dangerous or as outsiders in our society. So let's have a look at this idea of how the media reinforces these stereotypes. How does it actually continually repeat and reinforce the ideas that we've talked about? Well, with any group of people, there's obviously an enormous number of things that could be used for a stereotype. But because stereotyping is normally a form of simplification, only the most obvious things are used. And again, we kind of reduce this to sort of 4 different categories. The first one, and the most obvious one, is appearance. And so that can include physical appearance as well as clothing. And for the purposes of this argument, it also includes the sound of their voice. So let's take a stereotype of teachers. This one's usually attributed to geography teachers, but we won't single them out. All teachers wear dreadful old clothes, okay? So that idea that we're using an appearance as part of that stereotype. Second one, again, very, very obvious. Behaviour. Typical things that people like to do within that group. Okay, let's go for grannies. Little old ladies, what do they love to do? They love to knit. If you want to stereotype an old person in an advert or TV show, make them knit. We get the idea. Remember that Shreddies advert? Grannies love to knit Shreddies. Okay. Third thing that you can use, or that stereotypes often do, is to make sure that the stereotype is constructed in ways that fit that particular medium. Okay, so it would be no good using a sort of comical stereotype in a serious, dramatic TV show. It would be no good using a maybe quite offensive stereotype in an advertisement, because you might kind of alienate some audience members. It has to fit that medium. Dom Jolly's stereotype of the traffic warden would not necessarily work in a long-running drama serial on TV because it's so exaggerated. Okay, so make sure the stereotype constructed in a way that fits the medium. And finally, there's always some sort of comparison, whether real or imaginary, with what is normal. The reason we understand stereotypes is because we know what reality is like. And so a stereotype is often exaggerated because there is some sort of barometer or measure against that which is normal. So again, let's go back to that first collection of stereotypes you looked at in the starter. Throughout the different texts, think of the repeated media stereotype you considered throughout the different texts that reinforces stereotype. What different traits and ideas are repeated? So, are there elements of appearance that are repeated in the stereotype that you found? Are there elements of behaviour that were repeated as well? Is there a comparison with something that we consider to be normal? And what ways would you say, if you can, that this stereotype has been constructed that fits the medium that you found? So let's have a look to see how all this fits into the ideas of Stuart Hall. Okay, well, for the exam specification, they like us to break Hall down into these different constituent parts. And of course, this hits the nail on the head for the third one, that stereotyping as a form of representation reduces people to a few simple characteristics or traits. Okay, and of course that idea of breaking down a representation into its component parts is nothing new to us. It's something that we've looked at before, and it's something I want us to spend the remainder of this session looking at in some more detail, with first of all a word that we've used a few times but maybe never had a definition for: mediation. So let's explain what mediation is. Well, let's have a look. In our lives, arguably, we make the decisions as to what is worth our attention. We make those decisions as to what we focus on. People try and grab our attention, but by and large, we choose what we want to hear and what we want to look at and who we want to talk to. Mediation is all about the fact that the media, and through media products and texts, the media tries to decide this for us. It decides to tell us what we should be paying our attention to in life. And as a result, our version of reality is altered by the media. We do not get a crystal clear picture of what realism is. So in other words, mediation is the process of taking something real, a person, an event, an issue, a group of people, and changing its form to produce that media text. And we can say that mediation is achieved in three processes: selection, organisation, and focus. And of course, that's particularly interesting to us when we look at the news media and think about the assumptions of what people often assume is real. If you're wondering what this little image of a machine is at the bottom, well, this often helps me understand mediation a lot better. It's to think of the media as exactly that, a machine. So what happens? You get that thing that exists in reality, that person, a group of people, a place, an event, or even an issue, and pop it into our complicated contraption machine, and of course, what comes out the other end? A representation of that thing, okay? Not the thing itself, an altered version. The machine has done its work on it. And of course, once that representation comes out, the audience can decide what they want to do with it. They can either take the preferred reading, so the machine has done its job correctly, or if you're an audience member who can read things in your own way and reject representations, and you'll take an oppositional reading or possibly a negotiated reading. But what we're interested in right now is what happens inside the machine. What is going on in those complicated cogs and mechanisms in my overly heavily handed metaphor? Well, the first one, selection. So this is the process of choosing what you're going to use to represent that person, place, event, issue. Then organisation, where you edit, manipulate, add, take away. And then focusing, where you get to specifically look at a part of that representation. Let's put some flesh on this. Let's pick an example, and it would be remiss of us not to choose something as current as the pandemic. So let's think about a news item on the pandemic. Okay, let's think about your standard broadcast news item on the pandemic. What selection process does that news program go through when it's going to report a story on the pandemic? Well, obviously there are things like the footage that could be chosen, the different interviews you want to conduct and who you're going to talk to. Of course, there's so much information on the pandemic, you have to completely decide what information you're going to present. And of course, you select the tone as well. Is this super serious? Is it negative? Is it pessimistic? Or is it cautiously optimistic? What about the organisation? You're a news broadcast, half an hour programme. What organisation do you have to do on this? Well, of course, you have to edit the story together to make sure it makes sense and tells the story you want it to. And for a news broadcast, you have to decide what item on the news it goes in. As we've seen with the pandemic, it's dominated throughout the year of 2020. And of course, it ends up often as the first story. And finally, focusing. Well, this is about what you focus on with that one representation. So think, what could you focus on if you were to create a story about the pandemic? Well, obviously there are a huge amount of different issues, but just to pick a handful here, you could talk about the historic nature of the pandemic and how it's never happened like this before, or it's comparable to perhaps the Spanish flu of 1918 or whatever. You could focus, as the news often does, on the number of people who are sick or dying. Many stories now are focusing on the impact of the economy this pandemic is having and the loss of jobs. You could look at the international representation of the pandemic and how it's affecting countries overseas, and more recently looking at finding a cure or a vaccine. So if you imagine I've just dipped into the countless different ways that you could represent or could select, organise and focus. And so hopefully you can look at that and think, wow, there is literally hundreds of ways that the pandemic could be represented. If you followed each strand in a different way, you're telling a different story. And as we've discussed before, a single event that actually happened, that was experienced by people and witnessed, even though that was one event, that actually has the potential to be represented in a huge amount of different ways. As we've also looked at in class, the way a person is represented can end up defining them. The media can define a single person based on the amount of media, the products that they are represented by. And of course, the final idea, social groups can be reduced to little more than a set of simple signifiers, and this can be incredibly problematic. But let's take a more detailed look at Stuart Hall, and let's consider 3 different ways at looking at representation. The first one is what we call the reflective view of representation. Now, just to make clear from the start, Stuart Hall does not say that this is how representation works, but he does offer it as a version of reality or a version of representation that some people do believe. So this, what he calls a reflective view of representation, is this idea that when the media represents something, we take it to be the true meaning of the world. In fact, the media represents something that is reality. It creates a replica of it in the mind of the audience, like a reflection. And actually what's interesting is that many people believe that the news works like this, that the producers take the truth, an event, something that's happened, and just simply represent it as accurately as possible, give us the truth of what's happened in the world. And of course, this is quite an interesting view, and many people sort of live their lives feeling that what they see in the media can be a straightforward version, reflection of reality. However, we're media students, we should be a bit more savvy than that. Why might we consider this reflective view of representation to be naive? And do some people still believe that the news is a straightforward version of reality, a reflection of reality? If so, why? And if not, why don't people believe that anymore? Now, to give you a sort of an example of the problems with the reflective view of reality, and a few other versions of representation, I've picked a magazine, an American magazine called Life, which was hugely popular throughout the 1940s and 50s, but it's a really lovely magazine that takes on different aspects of American society throughout history. This, as you can see, is an edition from 1948. It's title is called Teenage Fun, and we see 2 teenagers harmlessly playing a parlour game, dressed very smartly, presumably at some kind of party. Well, if the reflective view of representation were true, then we would see teenagers as doing nothing more than playing harmless parlour games and just enjoying good, wholesome fun at parties. But even in the 1940s, that wasn't the complete truth about what teenagers were or what they got up to at parties and so on. But it's quite a nice little charming front cover that might suggest that that's actually what teenagers were like in the 1940s. Let's move on to an alternative view of representation. In fact, the opposite, the intentional view of representation. So this is the opposite of the reflective idea. And rather than saying that what we see in the media is just a straightforward version of reality, this is the version that perhaps the media completely constructs our view of the world. That in fact, the media is in complete control of how people see the world. They are presenting their view of the thing they're represented, and the words and the images that they use mean what they intend them to mean, okay? Otherwise known as the preferred reading. The meaning that producers of text would like the audience to receive are accepted and understood, and that we understand our world completely based on the media's representation. So my example from Life magazine here is a cover from the 1950s with the film star Rock Hudson in it. Rock Hudson being presented here as a chiseled, handsome movie star, an icon, and this is very much in keeping with his representations in the movies. Both in the movies and out of the movies, he was the kind of guy that men wanted to be and women wanted to be with. Constantly seen with beautiful actresses on his arm at award ceremonies and so on and so forth. His representations, as I said, in the films, as well as on the red carpet and in the rest of Hollywood, was as this kind of man's man. However, this representation of Rock Hudson wasn't a reality. Rock Hudson was gay. It was known by a number of people within the Hollywood industry and insiders and friends and so on. But this was something that was protected to stop his public persona from changing, as it was an era where where it would have not been as widely accepted. His homosexuality would not have been widely as accepted. It probably would have had a detrimental impact on his movie career. Eventually, of course, Rock Hudson sadly died through complication with AIDS in the 1980s, which again completely changed his representation from that 1950s. However, throughout that golden Hollywood era, Rock Hudson's representation was completely accepted by an audience and understood based on the movies and the other media products he was in. So this is kind of an interesting example of how perhaps the media has complete control over how we see the world. However, would it be a little bit paranoid to consider this to be the truth of the media society? Would it be paranoid to think of the media as entirely in control of how we view the world? There's another theorist called Jean Baudrillard who looks at postmodernism, and it's interesting to think about what he would say on this when we look at postmodernism and how society is perhaps a construction of reality. And of course there is one main argument against the intentionalist view of representation, is that basically the intentional view of representation is saying that we would only receive the preferred reading. Of course, some people can take an oppositional reading. Some people can take a negotiated reading. We do not have to consume the media exactly as it tells us. We have a choice. Based on our own knowledge of the world, based on our own opinions, our own ideologies, we can reject what the media presents to us. And so if we think of the intentional representation of intentional view of representation and contrast that with the reflective view of representation, we're going to end up with something in the middle. And this is what we call the constructionist view of representation. So this is looking at the fact that any representation is a mixture of the thing itself, the person, the event, the group of people being represented. Second of all, the opinions of the people doing the representation, okay, the encoders, in other words. What is their opinion on how are they trying to manipulate this representation? How are they embedding their own meaning? But we must also consider the audience, the decoders. How are they reacting to that representation? Okay, they get a say in how people respond to. They are part of the response to the media. We, as an audience member, can choose how representations are received. And of course, along with that is the context of the society in which representation is taking place. Okay, Rock Hudson may not have been able to come out during the 1950s golden era of Hollywood, but In a modern era, we would hope that a celebrity or a movie star coming out as gay would have no problems being accepted, or we would see no negative impact in their box office standings just because of their sexuality. And of course that hasn't always been true, and arguably is quite a recent progression in our society. So before we look at an example that I've got here from Life magazine again, what would you say is the strength of this model compared to the other two? And so finally, let's look at an example here. Let's think about what's going on. And I'm going to use Life magazine as my sample. So this is a Life magazine cover from 1945, September 1945. And it's called Auto Worker, okay, which is an American term which basically means mechanic, or someone who works on a factory line. So let's do the analysis, okay. First of all, how would you say this person is being represented? Make a list of how are mechanics, how are auto workers as a group in society being represented by this magazine? Just list some adjectives. Well, I'm sure your adjectives included things like positive words: hardworking, dedicated, serious, maybe even patriotic. Masculine is a word that often comes up here. How is that happening? How is that going on? How can we look at the different aspects itself? First of all, how is this man representing auto workers across America? How is he contributing to all those positive words? Well, the first thing is that he's quite a masculine looking man. Certainly for 1940s America, we see him, he's quite broad shouldered. He has very big hands, as we can see in the photograph. We can see his moustache, which at that time would have been a signifier of masculinity. But we can also see, to make him feel and look more serious, his furrowed brow, his serious countenance, frowning, looking past the camera, but also the fact that he's slightly sweating. We see kind of beads of sweat on his forehead, suggesting that he's been working hard. His hands are dirtied, suggesting that he has been hard at work all day. What about those doing the representation? How can we see, what have Life magazine done to represent auto workers in this way? Well, to answer this question, of course, the thing we need to decide is, who are the encoders? Obviously, Life magazine is the big answer here, but what people within Life magazine are responsible for this man and therefore auto workers' representation? Well, there's a few people, isn't there? There's the editor of the magazine, there are the writers of the magazine, and of course the photographer who took the picture. And that they all become significant. Clearly, Life magazine wants us to see auto workers as important, dedicated, serious, possibly even patriotic people. And they've done this in a number of ways. The first one is the framing, the shot type, okay? I mentioned before how big the guy's hands look. Well, that's partly because the photo, if you've noticed, is framed in a slightly low angle. It's quite subtle, but he is filmed in low angle shot, which makes him look bigger. Also, of course, the choice of setting. The guy's just, we assume, left the factory, which is behind him, but it is there as a key part of that photograph. He's in the foreground. The factory that he works in is in the background. He could have been photographed anywhere, couldn't he? He could have been pictured at home with his family. He could have been pictured maybe enjoying his time with friends in some sort of social club or pub or something like that. But he is there with the factory behind him, irrevocably linked to the factory. He is the factory in many ways. And of course, having him in the foreground and so prominent in that medium shot, almost a medium close-up really, suggests that the factories rely on people like him. So there's that low angle shot. He fills the frame. We imagine the photographer probably caught a moment where he was looking past the camera to create that feeling of dedication and seriousness as well. So Life magazine have done what they can to create this sense that these are important people. And of course, one thing that's easy to overlook, the fact that he's on the front cover in the first place. You know, we know that this is a front cover of a magazine which might use celebrity endorsement or have pictures of famous people on it, and yet they have decided to dedicate their front cover to the humble auto worker. In fact, actually removing his name, not giving us a specific person, we are given the job itself as a title. High praise indeed, and clearly they are dedicating this magazine to them. Now, the last two are slightly more complex, the reaction of the individual to the representation and the context of the society. We have discussed the preferred reading. I think everything, all the analysis we've given so far is what the preferred reading would be. But we have to delve into the context of the society to see why the audience would accept this preferred reading, why they would understand this preferred reading. And the clue here is really in the date, September 1945. Well, those of you who know your history will know that the Second World War ended in the summer of 1945, just a few months before that. Victory in Europe was in June, and in the Pacific was in the August. So we're not long after war. And in fact, we can imagine maybe if this magazine front cover was a few months earlier, we might have seen someone in military uniform being celebrated, the members of the Army or Air Force or Navy. But this was a time where America was desperately trying to get back to normal, trying to rebuild itself. Most countries, if not all, had a huge financial hit from contributing to the war in whatever way. And America was no different, and it was a time for America to rebuild. So this is a society which is going to champion and value its manufacturing, its industry. And of course, it should be no surprise then that a humble factory worker who represents that side of industry graces the front cover of this magazine. It's entirely keeping with the time, that late autumn 1945, whereby America is itself rebuilding. The new most important people in America would be the auto workers, the factory workers, the assemblers on factory lines, people like this man. And so the audience would accept this representation, would take that preferred reading. So hopefully you can see from that a representation is made up of any of those things. It's not just the person themselves. So a celebrity, for example, is not just completely in control of their representations, as you've discovered throughout our lessons. The media themselves don't get carte blanche on representing people and groups of people however they want. They can't control and manipulate things so that you have been deceived or coerced into believing whatever is in the media, because as an audience member you always have the option to take the preferred reading or the oppositional reading based on the information you have at the time, based on your own knowledge, but also based on the society in which you live, because of course the society in which you live will also determine the representations and how we understand them. Our evolving sense of society and what we find acceptable and unacceptable, what we tolerate and won't tolerate in our society, has always shaped the way that we understand representations and, of course, stereotypes. Well, we'll delve into that a little bit more in the next video, but until then, thanks very much. Bye-bye.